Well, I love regional differences in music. And one of the things I hate about the internet and the modern era is that it's kind of erasing all of that. But back in the days, especially when transportation was not easy, there wasn't freeways or anything like that, there were these regional musical styles that flourished. And they were all over the South. Really interesting stuff. In Muhlenberg County, Kentucky, for some reason or another, there was all these guys that started playing this particular style of thumb-picking guitar. The guy that you mentioned was an African-American musician named Arnold Schultz. And I think he was mostly a fiddle player, but he did play guitar, and he definitely influenced Bill Monroe. Bill Monroe has talked about seeing Arnold Schultz on the streets playing, and that's kind of where he got the blues from. It was the first time he had ever heard blues music. And he definitely influenced some of these guys in Muhlenberg County. I'm trying to remember the county that Bill Monroe is from, but Muhlenberg County, where Merle Travis, the Everly Brothers, and John Prine and all these people were from, is right next to the county where Bill Monroe is from. So Arnold Schultz kind of was just around. He was a street performer. There was a big debate about him and how much he influenced the Merle Travis style. But the one thing that's super weird about the Muhlenberg County guitar style is all these really intricate chords all up and down the neck that they play. Because there's other thumb-picking styles, like the stuff that Elizabeth Cotten did in the Carolinas, that sort of thing. But they don't have this crazy, sophisticated chordal structure thing. And I think that must have come from Arnold Schultz, because he was a guy that worked on the river boats and would go down to New Orleans and then come back up. That was the best conclusion I could come up with. Arnold Schultz also died really early. He never recorded, so nobody really knows what he sounded like. But by the 1930s, there was a guy named Mose Rager, who was really sort of the guy that influenced Merle and all these other people. Ike Everly, who was the father of the Everly Brothers. He actually had an act in the 1930s called the Everly Brothers. That was the original group with Ike and his three brothers. And Mose Rager and Ike Everly would play these church socials and on people's porches. And Merle Travis was this young kid who would watch them play, and then he'd grab a guitar and he would play them back what they had just played. He was sort of a prodigy in that regard. And just a fascinating story of that area producing this very sophisticated style of guitar playing that didn't really seem to exist anywhere else. So here's his career arc. Before he was in Nashville, the first thing that he did was he moved to Cincinnati, and that's where WLW was in the 1930s and 1940s. It was the only 500,000 watt radio station in America. They have these ones across the border in Mexico, but that was the only one that ever existed in America. Their thing at the time was no pre-recorded music. They wouldn't play records on the air. Everything was live, right? So there was this enormous opportunity for musicians to come in there. There was a variety show that they had on the radio called Boone County Jamboree that also sort of toured and played all the theaters in the tri-state area. And that was Merle's first professional gig. He got on WLW playing with a guy named Clayton McMitchin. The Clayton gig didn't last very long, but he stayed on, joined a group called the Drifting Pioneers that were very popular on the station. So all of a sudden he's being heard in all four corners of the United States, right? Just fresh off the boat out of Kentucky. And Merle was a bad drinker, as I mentioned. He got into some personal problems with his first wife and they weren't getting along. And he tried enlisting in the Marines for World War II, and they sent him home after 2 weeks. They found him unsuitable for service. And he was just kind of depressed, and so he hopped on a train and he moved to Hollywood, California. Right at the time, kind of that the war was getting over. The war was still happening, but it was right at the very end, right when Capitol Records was forming, right when all these very influential West Coast country music people like Stuart Hamblin and Cliffy Stone and Wesley Tuttle were all getting their careers started. And all of a sudden, here's this incredible guitar player and a guy who could tell jokes and write cartoons. And so they brought him into the fold immediately. And he started playing on Capitol Records sessions. And then he became a Capitol Records artist, I think in 1946, something like that. That was really where the Muhlenberg style of guitar got distributed throughout the world and the rest of America. That was the first time that people got to hear that style of guitar outside of Muhlenberg County. So an interesting thing about World War II in Los Angeles is that they had all these defense plants working 24 hours a day. And there was all these hillbillies that had moved out there, I mentioned earlier, from Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri and Arkansas and places like that. And they were working in these defense plants. And they wanted to hear country music when they got off work, right? So when Merle moved out there, there was a promoter named Foreman Phillips who put on these swing shift dances. And basically, you'd have your regular showtime at night. But then when that 8-hour shift got off at 6 in the morning or whatever, they'd play another dance, right? And then when the second shift got off, like 3 in the afternoon or whatever it is, there'd be another dance. I mean, it was probably the biggest opportunity for country musicians that has ever existed. All of them were working all of the time and they were making really good money, which is how all the thing of the Turk and the nudie suits came about. It's how the customized Bigsby guitars and things like that came about.
And it was all in California.
It was all in California, and they just had tons of money to spend, right? But to answer your question about Spade Cooley, Foreman Phillips was this promoter, and Spade Cooley had this band that was very popular, and they were really kind of like a Glenn Miller big band, but they had a steel guitar, and they wore Western outfits, right? But Foreman Phillips was the guy that actually came up with the name Western Swing. All of a sudden, in about 1944, 1945, he started advertising these Spade Cooley dances as Western Swing, and the idea was it was basically like going to see Tommy and Dorsey or Glenn Miller or something like that, but westernized, and that was the whole concept.
Okay.
And Merle Travis fell in that whole thing. I think he played with Spade Cooley a bit when he first got to town, and then Foreman Phillips was just putting him to work, like playing, you got to play at 6 a.m. here, and drive over here, play at 2 p.m. there, and then, so he was just right in the thick of all that.
He didn't even need to think about touring. He could do it all and sleep in his own bed at night.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
He didn't start touring nationally until late 40s, early 1950s.
So when he did start touring, could he sell tickets all over the country?
Yeah, because he had hits. Merle Travis had a bunch of hits in 1947, 1948. He was very that was the apex of his popularity. He was on the cover of Billboard magazine and things like that. They used to tour around in a big DeSoto limousine kind of a thing and just play one-nighters all over the country.
Who did he influence?
Well, most notably, especially since we're here in Nashville, when Merle played on the radio on WLW, Merle played like this. He had a thumb that did about 90% of the work, and then he had one finger that he would play like this. There was a kid listening in Tennessee named Chet Atkins, and he heard Merle on the radio, and he's like, "What is that?" And, Chet thought he must be using like all the fingers, right? So Chet learned how to play Merle Travis stuff, but with sort of a different finger setup. Obviously, Chet Atkins sort of changed the whole history of Nashville, Tennessee. He became like the de facto producer of everything and the tastemaker. And I'm not sure that Nashville would be known as Country Music USA if it wasn't for Chet Atkins. And that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't have been influenced by Merle Travis.
I love the innovation that happens when Chet is trying to copy Merle, but he only has the sound. He doesn't have a YouTube tutorial to make him do it exactly like him. So he misinterprets things, and it becomes something a little bit different, and his own thing. I love that about music.
And Chet had even said in some interviews that he was grateful that he heard him on the radio and didn't know what he was doing, because he said if he had seen him in person, he just would have tried copying him exactly. You know, it's interesting how it works out like that.
Yeah. Did his drinking catch up with him at some point in his career?
Yeah, many times. You know how alcoholism is. There's like a period of time where drinking like makes you really energized, and it makes you want to do all this stuff, and it makes you want to fight, and it makes you want to, he had that period of time in the 40s where he was drinking, but he was having a really good time. And then all of a sudden he started to not have a good time, but he just couldn't stop drinking. And so there were just blackout years, basically. He wrote 16 Tons, which became the #1 song of 1955. And then after 1956, he didn't go in the studio again until 1963, something like that. He just had a bunch of really bad years. And it was kind of at the height of his fame, but he had all this money coming in from 16 Tons, so he didn't necessarily have to work, and he just drank. The famous story is that Cliffy Stone, who was his A&R guy at Capitol Records, he said, "We need you to write some folk songs." And Merle's like, "You don't write folk songs, they've already been written." And so he put it off until the last minute, and then he came up with these 2 songs, just kind of like, in the space of minutes. 16 Tons, which, like I said, became the #1 hit in 1955 for Tennessee Ernie Ford, and has been recorded by a million other acts. And then also Dark as a Dungeon, which is, man, it's like a bluegrass standard, it's been recorded by everybody. He also wrote Smoke, Smoke, Smoke That Cigarette. And obviously there's a bunch of these guitar standard things that get played all the time that he wrote, or took an old folk melody he had heard back in Muhlenberg County and then turned it into some grandiose guitar thing. Yeah. A lot of those are standards now that he came up with.
When you were going through the storage space, were there any artifacts, any interesting artifacts attached to maybe other artists that you found, pieces, little trophies he picked up along the way, or gifts from somebody?
Yeah, absolutely. After all is said and done, and actually the book's been out for a few years, but this just happened this last year, I told his daughters, I said, what I really want out of this deal, because I didn't want to think about how much I made per hour. I got paid to write the book, but man, I must have put 10,000 hours in this book, I said, what I really want at the end of all this deal is, will you let me buy all the photos that were signed to Merle? Like, I don't want to interfere with your father's collection of his own stuff, but there's all these photos that he had autographed to him, and it was some really cool ones, obviously Johnny Cash and people like that, but then all these like super obscure carnival acts that he toured with in the 30s and 40s, and all these buxom women that would write these very flowery, like, "To Merle, I love you so much" kind of things. And to me, I just found it fascinating. And so they sold me this collection of all the photos and things that had been signed to Merle, which was really cool. And in that stuff was Merle's George Jones fan club card from 1957 or something like that, which is so great. This certifies that Merle Travis is a George Jones fan, Yeah, there's quite a few photos in the book. But as I mentioned, there were a million photos that he had saved. It was kind of incredible.
How did he pass away?
He died at home. He had a heart attack and just passed away. He had had a bunch of bad health, but he was actually kind of on the mend, and he was living in Oklahoma at the time. Another interesting story about Merle is that he was good friends with Hank Thompson, and he wound up marrying Hank Thompson's wife and living in this house that Hank had built on this lake in Oklahoma. And they referred to each other as husbands-in-law because they were still pals and stuff. It was a bizarre story. But Merle came back to the house there and was like taking the stuff out of his pockets at the dining room table, and he just fell over on the table, and that was it.
Is he buried there with Leon Russell and Bob Wills and?
No, he's actually buried in Ebenezer, Kentucky. There's a cemetery there where Mose Rager's buried, and some of his other family members are buried. And he was cremated. And there's a guy named Eddie Pennington, who's a fantastic Kentucky thumb picker. His grandson Caleb Coots was on our show last night. Eddie Pennington is a funeral director up there, and this is a fascinating story that's in the book, because everybody that I talked to kind of had stories after Merle died of him coming to them in their dreams, right? And to me, I always find that fascinating. And I'll just make this short. Eddie kept having these dreams that Merle was still traveling and that he wasn't at rest. And at the time, his ashes were just at the house in Oklahoma where he died, right? And so Eddie worked out to get a Wilbert burial vault. I remember that from his story that he told me, and to bury the ashes there in Ebenezer. And he said that after he did that, that he started having dreams that Merle was at peace and he was at rest. There's quite a few things where I kept waiting for somebody to write a book or somebody to do this compilation. And after years, it's like, oh man, I guess I have to do it, right? And that's kind of how it was with the Merle Travis book. There had been a box set. Bear Family had put out a box set, and it was very good, but it only went up to 1955. And there had never really been a Merle Travis book, and it just kept bugging me. And his daughters lived in Los Angeles, his two surviving daughters, and I would see them at shows, like they would come to see Marty Stewart or Tom Bresch or whoever. And I just kept planting this seed, like I really want to write the biography of your dad. And eventually they let me into the storage unit. And it was kind of amazing because Merle was maybe the worst alcoholic of all time. I don't know how else to say it. He really was just a bad, bad alcoholic. And he had moved a bunch of times, and he had gotten married at least 5 times, maybe 7 or 8. Somehow or another, he had saved every scrap of paper, every photograph, everything relating to his career from the 1930s up until the time that he died in 1983. And when I got in this storage unit, I'm looking at this stuff, I'm thinking, this is incredible. I mean, this is what you want, right? Especially for somebody who died 40 years ago. And in that stuff, he had started an autobiography and never finished it. But there was a few chapters. It was good, and it had never been published. And so I said, let me take this. I'm going to pitch this. And so I went to Scott Bomar, who had just started this wing of BMG, which is a big music corporation. He had started a publishing wing, basically to publish cool country music books. They did a book about Johnny Cash live at Folsom Prison. It was a big coffee table photo book and a complete history of the Byrds and Wanda Jackson's autobiography and things like that. So I pitched him this Merle Travis book, and he was like, yeah, let's do it. And so that led me down about a 3 or 4 year of research and road trips and interviews, and tried to interview as many 90-something-year-old people as I could because I knew they weren't going to be with us long. And it was just a fascinating journey, is what it was.
What a crazy amount of work to commit to, man.
He's an important guy, and I knew that there was only going to be one opportunity to do it, so it needed to be done right. Well, I think the thing that bugs me, and I do consider myself a preservationist more than anything else, is just I see so much stuff just kind of disappearing into the waste bins of history, and a lot of stuff just getting thrown out. It's really sad. So for me, I saw this as an opportunity to just preserve the memory of Merle's career and all the great stuff that he had accomplished. And when you're talking about a guy who died in 1983, like he had pretty much faded from public consciousness. So I'm just happy whenever I'm able to do something like that. And I've had all these young kids come out like, oh man, I'm discovering Merle Travis now, and I'm looking up all his music on YouTube, and that's the reward right there.